Hi there. I've been asking you for your favourite games played by David Bronstein, and I'm going to show you one of my favourite games that Bronstein played. This is from the Zürich 1953 Candidates Tournament, this famous tournament with a famous tournament book actually written by Bronstein himself. And I've taken some of his notes from there and also from his annotations in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which were a little bit different, which is kind of interesting. So this game played in round 13 of the tournament. Sammy Reshevsky with white, the American, great American hope in the 1950s. He was a serious candidate for the World Championship match, and you know, he was the great Western hope. He's playing with white and Bronstein was black. And now the background to this game. Smyslov was leading the tournament at this point. It was 28 rounds in the tournament, 28 games. This is round 13. Smyslov was leading by a point. Reshevsky was a point behind and was really Smyslov's main rival in the tournament. And here's what Bronstein had to say about this game. On the evening before this game, I was told by the heads of our delegation that after evaluating the situation in the tournament, they had come to a conclusion that I could win against Reshevsky, and I was ordered to do so. I love the language there, ordered to do so. I came to the game, sat down at the table, and never moved again until the game was adjourned. So there we go. Bronstein, for the greater good of the Soviet cause, was ordered to win against Reshevsky. Of course, Bronstein was also in contention for the first prize in this tournament. D4 from Reshevsky. And Bronstein plays his favourite King's Indian. And Reshevsky goes for the fianchetto variation. Of course, this has an excellent reputation. What's interesting is that Bronstein goes for the system with d6 and e5. Now, nowadays, basically, c6 and d5 is just standard. These big guys don't want to give any space in the centre. They don't want to give away the centre. Or, alternatively, they play the very sharp Grunfeld line against this. But Bronstein liked to go for d6 and e5. This was, well, I guess it was the standard way of playing then, but it has really fallen out of favour. You only need to look back at Kasparov's early games with this line, where after a bit he just gave up playing like this with black and switched over to c6 and d5. Nowadays, the big guys don't like to give their opponents so much space. I've got experience with this position from the white side, and I've always loved playing this with white. I mean, I'm basically an e4 player, but I did dabble with d4, and I was really happy to get this position. You have a space advantage, and that e-pawn is well protected by your pieces. And once you've kind of consolidated centre and the queen side, then the idea is to just roll up those pawns on the king side. But that's much later. More on that in a bit. Bronstein had won some beautiful games with this system. There was a wonderful game against Pachmann, for example, in the 1940s, and against Zita, I think it was. Both it's quite similar games, actually. Anyway, let's look at this one. Here, it's possible just to go b3 to make sure this pawn doesn't advance. b3 is very respectable. It's a good move. Queen c2 played by Reshevsky, also good. And here you can dabble with knight g4. This was actually played by Bronstein in the same tournament, and also played by Reshevsky later on as well. It's not that good. In any case, c6, but that's typical of the kind of tactics in this position, where suddenly this bishop opens up. But c6 is necessary to cover these squares. Also lets the queen out as well. Now, Reshevsky plays bishop e3. Bishop f4 is also a challenging move for black, putting pressure on this pawn. But bishop e3 played, also fine. And this knight starts a bit of a shuffle. Rook in the middle, and a4. Now, this is actually a very important position for the variation, being played on quite a few occasions, and white has a big choice here. Reshevsky played the knight back to e2 to immediately put pressure on that d-pawn. But as we'll see, Bronstein realized he didn't have to defend that passively. Instead of knight e2, I like this move a3. That's the move that I often played, which looks a bit funny to kind of give black potential access to this square. But controlling b4 is actually quite important in this line. It takes away that square from the queen, for example, or potentially from a knight, as we'll see a bit later. That can be important. And actually, structurally, it's not that bad. And as I said before, the idea is once the queen side is secured, to just roll up the pawns on the king side. The bishop usually goes back to f2 and can pop out here. Sometimes the knight drops back to e2 and g3. But yeah, f4, g4, bishop back, king goes to usually h2, bishop to g3. And it is a really nice position for white. Just that steamroller on the king side, and you're pressing on d6 as well. But you've got to control the tactics. g4 is also possible. f4 is also possible. But knight e2 played in this game, hitting the pawn on d6. Now, instead of defending that pawn passively with bishop f8 or queen c7, queen e7, Bronstein played queen a5. Excellent move. And, you know, it's these kind of tactics that make the King's Indian such a dangerous opening, and why, you know, you might think in theory white is better, but in practice it is very hard to control these tactics. So what happens on rook takes pawn? This didn't happen. Then knight e5 hits this one, and if b3, now watch what happens. Bishop takes pawn. Suddenly black's pieces spring to life, and this is a lot of fun for black. So yeah, two pieces for a rook. Well, a rook and a pawn. Well, basically black has a winning initiative here with the king in the middle. So Reshevsky realized he had to defend. Bishop f1. Knight e5 attacks this and also threatens this one. So the knight came back to d4. Well, you can see that basically white has been treading water here, whereas black has gained a few moves. And now I think a very important move from Bronstein. a3. Of course, white can't allow these pawns to be split. You've basically got to play b3 here. Well, first of all, actually, Reshevsky flicked in f4 and the knight went back, and then he played b3. Here's an interesting moment in the game. After f4, Reshevsky offered a draw. And, well, here's Bronstein's comment. Making this active move, Reshevsky offered a draw, although it would appear he was in a fighting mood, and would probably have been quite upset if I had accepted the offer. His inquiry, "Are you playing for a win?" appears to be more in the nature of a probe, designed to needle his opponents into some precipitate step. Very interesting observation from Bronstein, and Reshevsky was renowned for this kind of gamesmanship, let's put it like that. Well, Bronstein declined. He put the knight back on d7. Now b3, as I said, that move has to be made sooner or later. And now you can see that Bronstein has control over these squares. Knight a6, excellent move. So certainly the last few moves have gone in black's favour, and if you control b4, then you control c5, because white is never going to get in b4, and those knights are really impressive. Obviously attacking the queen, but basically in the long run looking at the a2 pawn, and that knight on c5 looks at e4. Queen e2 from Reshevsky, bishop d7, and now Bronstein says, yeah, well, maybe he wants to play rook e7, rook e8, put some pressure here. Well, basically Bronstein has taken control over the queen side. So Reshevsky has to turn his attention to the other side of the board. And here I would expect pawn to g4, with the idea of bringing that bishop out to these diagonals. And I think the game is still very much in the balance. I like black's position on the queen side, but you know, white still has some initiative on the other side of the board. But instead Reshevsky played e5, and I find it very strange that Bronstein doesn't comment on this move in either book, actually. I don't like this move at all from Reshevsky. It seems really anti-positional. Bronstein exchanged, so it's an isolated pawn. I understand that, of course, it somehow creates a little bit more space for white. If that knight could get into e4 on these squares, that would be wonderful. But that knight on c5 does a very good job of controlling the e4 square. And actually, I think this makes life much easier for black. Rook d8, g4. So I understand, yeah, of course, you know, white has activity here, but black has a firm blockade on e6. The kind of move we would like to play here with white is knight f5. You're using this space, but actually this could just be taken and the knight drops back. In fact, black is fine here. So bishop h4. Now things are starting to get critical. Bishop is on a good diagonal. Bronstein exchanges and plays queen c5. Good move. And you can see that queen looks through the rooks at the king on g1. And I think this queen move highlights one of the main differences between the two positions. Black's king has the cover of these pawns and the bishop. White's king is looking exposed because white has flung these pawns forward. That, of course, is always the danger when you move pawns up in front of your king. There's a big vacuum behind those pawns that black's pieces can potentially fill. And here, for example, if that rook retreats, then rook takes pawn already exploits the exposed nature of the king on that diagonal. So therefore rook e4. Well, it kind of looks impressive, but then again, you know, that pawn isn't going very far at the moment. Bronstein played bishop h6, attacking the rook. King h1 steps out of this pin, and now I'm sure that Reshevsky was begging or very much hoping that Bronstein would take that. Then, of course, the knight would come in, the bishop can come in. Well, of course, this is incredible compensation for white. But no, we don't need to play that. At the moment, that rook blocks the knight. Bishop e6, good move. Securely blockading the pawn and also opening up the d-file for that rook. And here, well, again, I'm sure that Bronstein was hoping that this exchange would be taken because black just has wonderful compensation. So, for example, if that rook moves, then rook d2 and, well, black is in here. And, yeah, finally that pawn falls and the pawn on a3 looking good. Reshevsky played g5. knocking the bishop back. But that's kind of unfortunate because now this bishop has a nice diagonal and the f5 is available. Here the players were both running short of time, and Bronstein plays a good move, bishop f5. In fact, he had a winning move here. Knight c2, good move. If queen takes knight, queen takes rook. And the knight attacks the rook. If this comes forward, knight d4. This is really painful for white. Black is winning material, and this can be taken without too much hassle. Or if not immediately taking this rook, then the e-pawn is going to drop, and black can take that with impunity. These kind of weird tactics, well, you know, if you're short of time, you might just might not see them. Bishop f5 is simply a good move, and I can see here that Bronstein was obviously hoping to be able to take that pawn very simply. I'm sure it didn't occur to him to move that knight from its splendid square on b4. But it's not that clear. Knight e4 played, and Bronstein said that he just was desperate to take that pawn, which would, you know, release black's rooks. But he realized that Reshevsky had prepared a nasty trap here. I mean, at first glance, it looks like this is winning with this nice pin. And if knight f6, well, let me see. I think we can just take that, and this has just got to be winning for black. That just looks incredible with the rooks and the bishops. Yeah, winning, and the exposed king. But no, after queen e5, rook takes bishop is very strong. If pawn takes, here's the crucial variation. Knight f6 check, bishop takes, and now pawn takes bishop. Threatening the queen. And if queen takes, queen g2 and mate follows. So a nice little trap, but instead, well, Bronstein could just remove that dangerous knight. And now here's a great move from Bronstein. Clearly, white would like to play e6 to get his rooks into the game, to try to get through to black's king. Rook e6 kind of looks reasonable in that respect, and perhaps, you know, moving the next rook over and taking here. But this one is not so clear. After this, and then h4. And if that light squared bishop gets in the game, well, this is looking not so good for black. I mean, I think black is always going to be okay, I think, because of that knight. But you can see that white is back in the game. So what did Bronstein do? He played the knight back to a6, removing that knight from its dream square. And if it can blockade on e6, then that really just shuts these major pieces out of the game, and, well, black will be able to turn to the d file. So this forces white's hand. White really has to push this before the knight comes over. Bronstein took, and now here's what Bronstein had to say about this position. Here, Reshevsky offered a draw, and this time I believe he meant it. Funny comment from Bronstein. Well, it seems to me that I'm sure Reshevsky realized that the game was turning away from him. Because even though he's broken through a little bit to the king, in fact, this pawn on a3 it represents a serious threat. And white's king is still a bit more exposed than black's. And Bronstein goes on, at this moment I clearly remembered my instructions. Play to win. The only possibility to achieve this was to avoid simplification. By this time we were both in great time trouble. That's interesting. I mean, I think black still has the advantage in this position. But Bronstein played rook f8 to keep as much material on the board as possible. Really interesting. And I still prefer black. Rook e7 played, and bishop d4 attacks the rook. The rook came forward, and queen f5. So this swings over, attacking this, and the knight is preparing to return to the fray, attacking the rook on e6. So therefore, rook e8. So that means that if queen takes, that can be taken. Remember, there's a pin there. So knight c5 played. Rook takes d8. Knight takes e6. Rook takes, and king takes. And here the game was adjourned. They've made the time control at move 40, and there's an adjournment. So Reshevsky had to seal a move. Reshevsky apparently thought for a very long time before sealing this next move. Bishop g3 was the move. So he realizes he's in trouble. Black's pieces are so active. And he gives up this pawn. Yeah, if knight takes g5, then white has enough activity here. Let's go back. Yeah, he's going to make a draw there. So after bishop g3, Bronstein took the pawn with the queen, and now we simplify into an endgame with queen and opposite color bishops. This is winning for black. And the reason is the weakness of the pawn on a2 and the fact that white's king is very exposed. Naturally, it's important that white can't take this. It's a nice variation, actually. The king kind of chases or moves towards the queen, and now the checks have run out. You can see the bishop covers here. Well, there's one more check here. And basically that's that. It's mate at the other end of the board. So here, white is unable to take the pawn. The queen is just too far offside and has to return to the king side to defend against the mate. Queen c3, king g2, queen check, queen e2, check, and king d6. So here we can see that if the queens are exchanged, then this is a winning endgame. It's really not difficult, actually. Basically, white has to defend here with the bishop, and black will be able to come over with the king, will be able to advance these pawns, create a second pass pawn which ties the king there, and then black's king will basically be able to invade on the queen side and force a win. So white is unable to exchange, and that obviously is a problem. Now this is nice. Queen e d4 check. Basically what Bronstein does next, the next thing, is to make sure that his king is safe on this side of the board. He can take his time here. And he maintains threats at the other end of the board, so white has to be very careful. And now, having secured the king, he can advance on the king side, which actually squeezes white's king even more. This isn't just about creating a passed pawn, it's really about setting up a mating net. If queen takes, whoops, check and mate next move. So you can see that white is in a desperate situation here. There's really nothing to do. So Bronstein creates that passed pawn, advances the g-pawn. No, over the next few moves, he just takes his time. He lets Reshevsky sweat. Bronstein came back to c7. Another way of winning is to play king a5, force an exchange of queens, and then bring the king in here to take this pawn. But Bronstein was intent on checkmate. Well, why not? So there's just a little bit of shuffling over the next few moves. But basically Bronstein sets up a position which is Zugzwang. So here, b4, bishop d4. And that is the end of the game. And as Bronstein comments, seeing no way out, Reshevsky allowed his flag to fall, upon which he was scored a loss. Yeah. Well, there's nothing more for white to do here. It's interesting. You know, Reshevsky was kind of so stubborn. He just couldn't bear to actually resign. He let himself, you know, he just lost on time instead. Okay, so why did Reshevsky abandon hope here? Well, okay, let's give a check. You can see the king is completely secure on this side of the board. Queen g2. The queen has to keep defending against queen g1. g3, and this really is the end. There are no more sensible moves. If the queen goes this way, it's queen g1 is mate. If the bishop moves, obviously the king has no legal move, and if the bishop moves, then the queen can cut back. There's no longer a queen h3 to defend, and well, that's the only move anyway. And that's checkmate. So a beautiful Zugzwang position at the end here. I love that game. I think it shows Bronstein's tactical skill in many moments, you know, even right at the start where we had this position where, you know, he'd calculated that rook takes pawn, actually that would unleash black's pieces. I think positionally he played beautifully after a3 and switching that knight round to b4. I think that's wonderful. And then later on in this very tense situation around about here, he was still in command of the tactics, but understood that positionally he still actually stood very well. And then at the end, wonderful technique in this endgame. I like his king march over to the side of the board, and yeah, beautiful Zugzwang at the end. There you go. I've really enjoyed this little excursion into Bronstein's games. I'm sure I'll be showing more of them in the future anyway. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. You can find the links down there. Thanks for watching.